Welcome to the EnLight Life podcast with Alexandra Cousins. Together we'll demystify disease and the debates around health, empowering you toward real regeneration and a life of vibrant vitality.
Welcome everyone to our EnLight Life podcast, and today I'm with Varun from EnLight Life, not quite, from True Diagnostics, and he is the research director at True Diagnostics, and I am super excited to talk about the epigenetic test that we've been already offering for the last 6 months and a bit. And for everyone to understand why testing your epigenetics is probably one of the best ideas, and what is the importance of testing epigenetics. So thank you for being here, Varun. Let's clear things up for people who have no idea why they should be testing epigenetics, or even what does it mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me on this podcast. It's actually a great treat to be able to speak to the people that are using a lot of this, especially since my background has been really developing a lot of these tools. So in a nutshell, what your epigenetics is essentially the interpretation of your genetics. I think a lot of your viewers are very familiar with 23andMe and understanding the importance of getting your genetics tested, because ultimately that's a conduit in understanding what is already there, what is pre-described. So any kind of genetic diseases that are occurring, that's what a genetic test will identify. One of the limitations that we've observed with genetic tests is that once you understand that you're predisposed to a certain disease, what can you do to that? Right? I mean, it's kind of there existing. Maybe you can do things to manage it, but really there's no other way to see if it ever changes. And actually it doesn't, because your DNA, the genetics is really looking at your DNA, and DNA doesn't change as a biomolecule by itself. But right. The way that the body or the cells have come up to interpret the DNA is by using epigenetics, using a lot of these biomolecules to say that, okay, if your diet changes, if the pollution around you changes, even the methods of how you're perceiving stress, if any of those change, rather than changing the DNA itself, these epigenetic marks can be altered to interpret the DNA in a different way. And so when we were coming out as a company, we started to realize there's not much of a representation of being able to take a simple blood test and look at your epigenetics, because everyone was doing really genetic testing and not epigenetics. So that's where we came in, and we developed a lot of these tools to interpret your epigenetics. And what we found was that a lot of those outputs can then be directly actionable, because many of these epigenetic marks are changing rapidly, based on, in a matter of weeks. And so this really becomes an actionable test. So when you think about epigenetics, think about epi as above the genetics, how those molecules, without even changing your DNA or your genetics, the interpreters of your genetics are changing. And just to kind of make sure everyone understands, when I say epigenetics, especially for those that are geneticists, we're really talking about DNA methylation.
Right. So by looking at the epigenetic test, we understand in real time what is happening in our body now, how our genes are expressing, how efficiently they are expressing. And when we're talking methylation, really also, because I think for a lot of us, in some ways, it still is kind of tricky to understand, well, what exactly is methylation? A lot of us, we talk about it. I like to see methylation as how well are our cells detoxing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So detoxing could be one of those biological pathways that is really influenced by the presence or absence of those methylation marks. Because when you think about it, every process in your body, the production of a protein, the response of a hormone, has to look at a blueprint. And so these DNA methylation marks will allow the increase or decrease of that process to be present or absent.
Right. And so to go a little bit further, because I've definitely found so much use for this epigenetic test, and I think it's one of the best ways to certainly get a really good and fast overview on what is going on all levels, right? Because we're looking at nutrition. We're looking at, I think in total it's 155 biomarkers. I know it changes a little. You add things. So we're really getting a vast picture into how our biology is currently expressing. And then we can go, depending on what is showing up, where our bottlenecks might be, our deficiencies, we can take really good action. And then also, because this test is so sensitive, and I would still like to understand how sensitive is it? So you're saying within weeks, things can change. So just by adjusting our supplements, our nutrition, maybe, detoxing certain pathways better, affecting mitochondrial function, we can actually very quickly see, okay, we're moving the needle in the right direction.
Yeah. And the reason why we say weeks is because, we've worked with individuals. This test is really primed for that N of one type of study, if you will, because, as much as you can do large clinical studies, really what works for you is much more important sometimes than looking at a whole panel of individuals. But in the same vein, the reason why we say weeks is because a lot of our work and why there's a research focus within our company is we really want to understand a lot of these tools. And so, for instance, some of those predictors that you were saying, the 155, a lot of them actually calculate something called your biological age based on your epigenetics. And when we started to do some of these clinical studies and apply these clocks in clinical studies, we were very surprised, especially with this one paper that we released about a year ago, that within 8 weeks, with just a change in your diet, we were able to significantly reduce 12 of those predictors, those biological age predictors, within just by changing the kind of food that they were eating, going into a vegan diet. So I'm not trying to say anything about the diet itself, but really showing the sensitivity of these predictors in the context of being able to modulate your biological age, and really showing how this biomolecule of DNA methylation is able to capture a lot of these changes.
Right. So when we're talking sensitivity, because the epigenetic test also picks up already on how is the body trending, right? So that means,
absolutely.
So in some ways we're looking, it's a picture of what direction is your system going, and is it a good one? Is it desirable, or is it undesirable? And
exactly.
What I like about this test is that, in today's world, and I know I've been guilty of that, where we buy into some philosophy, right? And it doesn't really matter what it is. It can be the philosophy of doing NADIVs on a regular basis. It can be the philosophy of veganism. It can be the philosophy of carnivore. It doesn't even matter. But we love to buy into philosophies, and sometimes we get enamored with, an influencer or a doctor that tells us something, and then off we go because it sounds so convincing, and we do it. And then we test and we go, well, this is actually not working. The reality is actually that a lot of people don't test because, of course, your test is still, I do feel most people in the industry know about it, but of course, there's a lot of people still that need to know about it. And so my newest thing since understanding your epigenetic test and having seen the results, what I like to tell people, rather than think that something is working for you and staying attached to that philosophy, or to that supplement for that matter, right? Because there's a lot of supplements out there that are being sold to us as the thing, but then is it working?
I absolutely agree with that. And I'm actually very happy, Alexandra, that you brought up this whole idea of the trends, because a lot of people, when they take these tests, even with my conversations with some of these test users, they get really caught up with, hey, I'm 35 years of age, but it showed us 40. I don't believe your test because I work out every day. I do all these things. I prescribe to Peter Attia. I'm following that entire diet. And I'm not saying here, and what I like to remind them is, hey, maybe you're doing all of that, but maybe is that really geared for you in this concept of N of one? And also, you're just basing it off of one data point. The real data points that really come out to kind of, to your point, to show a lot of that trends is you got to take a test again. You have to put this in the context of everything else. If you read a single word out of a book, do you really understand the story that's coming out? Yeah. And so that's what I try to tell people. And I think you hit the nail on the head, where you really need to consider, is this working for you? You can find different philosophies. That's the whole thing. Like, I'm trying to find a different philosophy or whatever, but you got to be able to objectively define it using some type of test, whether it be a epigenetic test, a genetic test, maybe a physiological test. But where epigenetics really comes into play is really understanding the cellular, which you really cannot measure just by looking.
Right. And I find even we can go deeply into blood panels and go sophisticated blood panels, but that still is not going to tell us the full story, because we all know in order for blood markers to change, especially some of the markers, by the time that they have actually changed, we're already in trouble.
Yeah.
So, that is the reality. I mean, I've seen people show up on your test as disasters. Their bloods were good.
Yeah.
And so,
if you think of, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please.
Well, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Like, the way, I know this is a little bit on like this, maybe a little bit more on the molecular biology side, but if you think about what we're looking at as a biomarker, there's this concept of a central dogma where epigenetics is upstream of your genetics, and then genetics leads to transcription, then transcription leads to protein synthesis. And proteins, I think a lot of what people understand, are really the biomolecules that cause a lot of these biological processes. So if you think about it in that linear relationship, the moment that you do those clinical panels, I think you hit the nail on the head again. If you start to see those changes, that means that you did all of these different processes for that biological process to occur. So if you can go more upstream, then maybe that could be a little bit more predictive of what could happen in the future.
Right. And I think that's the big shift. Certainly that's the shift that happened for me. The more that I understood that we need to act at the highest level. So when we can influence things at the highest level, we don't need to focus so much on the downstream, because we're acting where it matters the most. Yeah. And that's where my personal fascination really began, with working with peptide bioregulators and peptides as well, working on a mitochondrial level rather than influencing a whole bunch of things in the gut or doing, the killing of pathogens and all of that. Well, if the pathogens are there, we need to look what's happening in the environment for them to be so comfortable.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, so I mentioned a name, Peter Attia, recently, and I'm a big fan, hit a lot of his work. And, one of the things I think your listeners might already know this, is that you can really create a biological age predictor, if we're thinking about that, from anything. It doesn't have to just be epigenetics. You can create it from your physiological outputs. You can do whatever. There was a message that he recently shared, which I thought was fascinating. He was like, the true biological age can be captured just by looking at VO2 max. That is, personally, I partially agree with that. I think that VO2 max is a great physiological measure to really look at your biological age. But then it goes back to the same point. By the time your VO2 max has changed, that means internally, cellularly, everything molecularly has already done its changes. So if your VO2 max has decreased, which is bad, essentially because of your lung function, it's a representation that your lung function is worse. That means your cellular environments have completely been eradicated, especially in your lungs, to not allow you to have a good, stable lung function output as characterized by the VO2 max. And so I think that that's where, a lot of times I try to tell people it's not just about, epigenetic tests, even though epigenetic tests really do show that internal underpinnings. Whenever you're looking at your health, you have to understand the context in which that measure is being shown. So if your, let's say, physiological outputs are being decreased, that means the damage is already done internally. And it's now finally realizing. So then switching from from below to above becomes a little bit harder than when you can capture that before.
I think this is the key for people to understand and to actually take their health into their hands, like we said, from a much higher level. I also feel that a lot of people, and I used to be one of them, I used to be I come from a very natural approach. Many, many years, detox fasting, raw foods, that was my world.
Yeah.
And then as I got older and hormones began to change and things didn't work as well as they used to, that's when I got into all the testing and all the things. And it really made me realize it's great to go according to your intuition and your feeling and, all for that. And we are blessed to have these incredibly sophisticated tests nowadays. Some of them, of course, are also just super, super new, like your test. So most people are not going to know about it. But I would say make use. My message now to my clients is why guess? Why wonder or stay attached to a certain product, philosophy, whatever it is? Go and test and then work according to what the results say, right?
Yeah.
It's really that simple. So I would love to hear from you a little bit. What have you been noticing? Because of course, my sample is much smaller than your sample. And I can say what I've seen, and sometimes shockingly so, because a lot of my clients, I mean, yes, a good portion of them have severe health issues that they haven't been able to resolve for many, many years. And so, of course, their epigenetic results are not going to be great. But I've also had a handful of clients who they're doing all the things, and they've been doing all of the things for many years. And epigenetics also still aren't as brilliant as we thought that they would be. And maybe what I'm seeing the most weaknesses is on a mitochondrial level. There seems to be a lot of mitochondrial damage, even for those people that on the outside, they're doing all of the things and they're hitting a lot of the good stuff, but mitochondrial damage is still there. Of course, we're seeing shockingly forever chemicals. I think they're pretty much high in, dare I say, everyone.
Yeah. It tends to be very, so it's a very good point, especially because I was about to say, as you were introducing that topic, mitochondrial damage is usually the one that we see. And also just chronic inflammation, It's funny because in our reports, we have actually two different reports. One report that actually looks at this concept of biological age, and we can go through that if, maybe in a bit. But then we have this really new, very recently released report called True Health, where what we're essentially doing is using epigenetics as a proxy to estimate what you would typically get from a lab panel. So, your CRP, IL-6. But then not only those two, but we go beyond to give about, I think, 150 or 155 different outputs. So based on the True Health, what we're noticing is that even if their biological age is, let's just say, 3 years younger, to your point, actually their mitochondrial stress and metabolic dysfunction panels, those particular EBPs, that's what we call them, epigenetic biomarker proxies. The EBPs associated with mitochondrial stress and metabolic dysfunction tend to always be out of range. And which is really kind of, to your point, concerning because, based on these biological age clocks, you would assume even internally that they're doing really well. They're able to deadlift, 405 pounds in the States. And, they think that they're very fit and physiologically very fit. And yet the mitochondrial or EBPs are not showing out to be as good. And it really comes back to understanding what those biomarkers are looking at. We're seeing that, especially with these biomarkers, diet, exposure, and stress are very much ingrained with what these particular DNA methylation sites are showing. If you are actually experiencing a great deal of stress and you're not mitigating that actually gets captured by the DNA methylation marks. And that is translating to a lot of these outputs being changed. you mentioned a little bit about maybe a menopause, perimenopausal women. We consistently see increases in leptins because we actually have an EBP version of leptin. CRP EBPs are going up. GDF15 tends to go up as well. And that's consistent with the increases with many of those epigenetic age clocks that we also produce. So I think looking at all of these, just to your point, it's surprising that even the best individual physiologically can have a panel that doesn't look that great.
Mm-hmm. And would you, so what the trends that I'm seeing is, where typically the bottlenecks are or the weaknesses are, is like we said, mitochondrial function, NAD recycling, which then sometimes also makes me think, is all of this NAD therapy working? Right?
Yeah. I will say I'm not an expert in NAD synthesis and NAD therapy, but if we just look back at the data, it seems like the push of those NADs associated EBPs, it's not changing that much. And so if an individual, let's say, is undergoing NAD therapy and those markers aren't changing, it could be two things. One, maybe our NAD markers aren't as optimized, possible, but the problem with that statement is that we've tested this with data sets of NAD and non-NAD patients, and we see that it's sensitive enough to pick up those change. Or number two is that particular therapy is not working in the context of these epigenetic EBPs. So that is a possibility that maybe our current NAD therapies to you as a personalized intervention may not be as effective. And it goes back to that whole idea of N of 1. A generalized therapy may not be the right therapy for you. Generalized means, generally speaking, it could help, but maybe there needs to be optimization that needs to occur in order to help you. And that's where these tests come into play.
Right. And I think a lot of these treatments, supplements, oftentimes we look at what do they do in a petri dish, and we don't really look at what do they do in a human body, and then also in certain set of circumstances. Because, for example, I've definitely seen when people with already weak mitochondrial function, weak immune system, broken down microbiome and all of that, when they begin to do NAD IVs, they feel worse.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, one thing that really comes to mind when you say that is, I mean, obviously, so what we've seen in some of our clinical studies. So, for example, we had a clinical study with dasatinib and quercetin, which senolytics are a huge therapeutic that people start to use. What we see in some of those, especially in the context of these epigenetic predictors, is that we see a point of, we call it either a hormetic response or B, an adjustment period, where the body is getting shocked by this exogenous amount of therapy, or like any type of fluid that's being consumed. And especially with this NAD, the influx of NAD biomolecules is causing a state of shock for a lot of the cells. And thus maybe that feeling of discomfort can also be translated to an elevated epigenetic age or out of range epigenetic signals, which then can stabilize later on. So that is one thing that we've seen and we've shown in some of our clinical trials. So that isn't a fair point, that maybe as you maintain the NAD therapy, it could get better, but it is something that we've seen in our research.
Right. So we're back to saying test instead of guess, because I would say especially if we are after longevity and we're trying to do all the things, I really feel people are not testing enough. And that's a mistake, because then we create theories upon maybe how we look. I mean, I've seen, definitely people with six packs and, ripped physiques, and their epigenetics didn't look so great. They were headed for pre-diabetes, for that matter.
And it's kind of funny because we actually do routinely test athletes, and they're actually the worst performers. compared to a general individual who is actually taking a holistic approach. We have theories, obviously, these are things that we will have to test in a controlled setting, but some of the ideas that we have of why these athletes are, showing increased biological age or showing some out of range EBPs is likely because they're putting their body through a lot of stress to be able to build that muscle, to be athletes in general. Being an athlete is not a walk in the park, if you will.
Yes, which, it brings to mind nowadays, everyone wants to look like an athlete.
Right.
And what are we doing by chasing those extremes? And really the body, yes, it likes to be stressed, but it also likes to be not stressed at all.
Yes.
And to find that balance of the right stressors, but not too much of that, so that actually overall the body is not stressed.
Yeah, the body likes homeostasis. It likes to stay in homeostasis.
Right. So I would love to hear from you, because again, you've observed, so much more data. Can you quantify or can you qualify what maybe diets, or actually let's angle it from this way. Do you feel that really diet is very bio-individual, or can we say that there is a trend showing that a certain diet is better?
Absolutely. I think this is where those clinical trials that I was mentioning may give you a little bit of a generalization, because again, generalizations, even though I was saying something negative about it, there are general trends, right?
Yeah.
And so what we've noticed is, so we've done a couple of studies, and I'll also kind of highlight some studies that I found fascinating. So the one that we did was actually on sets of twins. So this is the perfect kind of case and control, where you have two genetically identical individuals, and then both of them were they had their own original diet. So either they were omnivorous or carnivorous or even vegetarian but that was not controlled for initially. But when we started the trial, we set randomly one set of twins on a vegetarian diet while the other one was set on an omnivorous diet. Once they were going through the process of this entire trial, by 8 weeks, we were able to collect the blood samples, because that's how we're calculating a lot of these epigenetic marks. Is we just take some of the blood, we run it through our process, and then be able to use different machine learning models that we've developed. And so by 8 weeks, what we were able to do was compare within the same individual 8 weeks versus 0 weeks to see if any of those biological age predictors changed, but then also compare at 8 weeks the one twin to the other twin, because we now know that genetically they're very similar. So really the only changes that we're comparing, or the only differences we're comparing, are the methylation sites. And what we've noticed was that across 12 of these epigenetic clocks, that the vegan twin showed significant decreases across all of the individuals. So I think this was about 21 pairs of twins. Across those 21 pairs of twins, the vegan twins showed a significant decrease in their overall biological age, whereas the omnivores showed no significant change whatsoever. Obviously, within the individuals, some people responded well, other people didn't respond that well, but the importance here is significant. When I say that, that means that the statistical test also looks at how consistently there was a decrease versus how if there was a significant decrease or a concerted decrease in the other one. And it was a very interesting finding, because we didn't think that 8 weeks was enough to kind of make that change. So it does suggest in that short amount of time, that 8 week time, maybe a vegan diet does improve your ability or your biological age state as quantified by epigenetics. The other thing I've seen is Mediterranean diets seem to do a decent job. But we also see that within demographics, certain diets respond really well. The Mediterranean diet seems to be encompassing of multiple different nationalities and different races. But then we also see that, carnivorous diets tend to also decrease within certain Nordic representation of individuals versus those that are not, maybe in the past, they don't really come from a meat eating culture, if you will. So So to your point, yeah. So those kind of diet changes really are shown. Omega-3, actually, omega-3 just by itself has been shown to significantly decrease your biological age, if that's the measure that you're using. So even taking fish oil or any kind of algae-based omega-3 supplementation tends to do a decent job. And also caloric restriction. So the amount of calories that you take, a 25% reduction in your overall caloric restriction can actually decrease certain biological age clocks, but these are the clocks that are based on your overall rate of aging or mortality risk. So it's not just your chronological age. These clocks were developed based on important aging signals that are disease associated. So these are some of the things that we're seeing from maybe a supplementation / diet side.
And I'm curious, have you tested any carnivores?
Yeah, so not us in particular. There was a study that looked at carnivorous diets. In that case, vitamin B12, it seems like vitamin B12 enriched foods, which tends to include a lot of meat, tends to decrease your biological age a little bit more than, let's say, non-vitamin B12. But apart from that, I mean, yeah, again, these epigenetic clocks are so new that they're starting to be introduced into a lot of these clinical trials. And so that actually was one of the things that we're starting to look into now is we did the vegan versus omnivore, but what if we also included a vitamin B12 enriched or omega-3 enriched diet that has carnivorous elements like meat and all of that. So studies are going to happen, but as of now, vitamin B12 is really the biggest thing that we've seen.
Okay. And what would you say, so because we're seeing more mitochondrial damage, which I would assume the reason being for that is the level of toxicity that we are all exposed to. A shocking result that I saw, a client of mine, she has been on a fully organic diet for 5 years, and yet her glyphosate levels were quite high, right? So here you're thinking, I'm investing in myself, I'm doing all the right things, and I'm going to be strictly organic, which of course we know is more expensive and just more, work anyway. Yeah. And yet my glyphosate levels are still high. So that was a bit of a shocker. But now, so we do know the toxins, the forever chemicals and all of that has a big impact on mitochondrial health. Would you say that there's something else other than, of course, stress that is deeply impacting mitochondrial health and that's what we're seeing trend-wise?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in order to quantify that, we'd have to actually look at a controlled study. As of now, I mean, the only other thing I could think of is just general inflammation. It's a very good question. As of now, from the data itself, we haven't really seen specifically effects of just the mitochondrial change, just because we haven't really been able to conduct a human trial where, a certain set of individuals have mitochondrial dysfunction. We could maybe capture that tangentially through disease states. It's just general disease states, correct? And if that's the case, then yes, the majority of diseases, especially mitochondrial-based diseases, tend to show increases or decreases. But but that's more correlation rather than causation. So, one of these EVPs that we've developed, they really were developed in the last year. So we're kind of parsing through this. And so we'll definitely take a look at the mitochondrial dysregulation to see if there are certain panels that are able to capture that a little bit clearer or clearly. Yeah.
And anything around, have you seen people or studied people that have done a lot of detox and then post-detox increased or improved biomarkers?
Yeah. Not yet in terms of clinical studies, research studies. We did do a recent pilot. So this wasn't a randomized control trial. So that's one thing that I would highlight. But this recent pilot study, we actually looked at supplementation, which had a few different supplements that were combined together. So this includes some NAD, NMN, This includes rutin, additional natural products that were combined together. And ultimately what we saw was that it actually invokes a sense of detoxing, especially in the epigenetic signatures. And what we saw was that even with these kind of natural supplements, some of the clocks tended to increase within the first, it was a 12-month study, and the time points that we collected were 0, 3, 6, and 12. Between 0 to 3 and 0 to 6, depending on which epigenetic predictor that we looked at, there was an increase. But then from 6 to 12, there was a significant decrease. Going back to this idea of there's a stabilization period, but then after the body is tuned for this particular supplement, there's almost like a detoxing, or there's an adjustment to a decreased level of biological age. So many of and the reason why I bring this up is because many of those natural products were attacking, for example, mitochondrial dysregulation. It was attacking certain biological processes that were really associated with inflammation and also circadian rhythm. Because what we see is also with individuals that have disrupted sleep or circadian rhythm that's completely disadjusted, if you will. Yeah. Those epigenetic ages tend to suffer. And so by using these natural supplements, we were able to essentially correct or detox to fix those kind of problems. And we see those decreases later on. So maybe it doesn't answer your question 100%, but I think that what it does show is that there are ways to alleviate these issues, and that it does suggest that any type of detoxing protocol, like for example, saunas, we see saunas being decreasing in their biological age as well, based on these epigenetic clocks. They do tend to have a not only a physiological positive response, but even from a molecular perspective, as quantified by epigenetics.
Right. What I find interesting, what you just said, is that you tend to see an initial increase in biological age, and then there's the decrease. And it correlates with my experience. So what I see oftentimes when we begin to take action, whether it's detoxification, regeneration, right, on all fronts, we often see a initial worsening, or rather certain things get better, but other things get worse. And I would say that happens for the first, well, not just for the first 6 months, because in some ways, I work in regenerative ways. So we're kind of working in cycles. We're always working on systems. Yeah. And there is this, we're going to see certain things improve and other things, almost new things pop up. And, a lot of times clients don't understand what's happening because they're used to traditional medicine.
Where it's just reactive.
Medicine. Yeah, you pop a pill, all gets better because all gets suppressed. Whereas when we work in regenerative ways, now we're giving the body more power to function on all cylinders, basically. And that initial kind of uptake in capacity oftentimes will also mean that things that the body wasn't taking care of, all of a sudden they're coming to the forefront. And so there is this worsening, either in symptoms, or I like the fact that it also shows up in biological clock, because that makes so much sense. There's more stress on the body, more strain, until we've worked long enough to kind of then, go the opposite way of the bell curve.
Yeah, we have preliminary data right now with hyperbaric oxygen treatment that does the same thing. And that's what's really puzzling, because, it's happened so many times that it's making me think that maybe this is just a natural process of the body. And maybe certain things are, expanding that. So for example, in the vegan trial that we did, maybe the same thing was there, but it's because veganism or like the diet is less of a systemic impact than something like, being in a low pressure environment like HBOT. There was a quote, as you were kind of mentioning, that it was reminding me is you give a person a fish, you feed them for one day, but then you teach that person to fish, they will be fed for a long time, if not forever. And I think that that's the difference between the type of, popping a pill where you alleviate it then, but the body is not being able to be primed, versus things like being able to change your body based on these tests. And it does go to show these interventions, doing the more of the natural type of remedies, you are essentially teaching the body how to achieve that homeostatic level.
Absolutely. I mean, we see that with the peptide bioregulators,
Yeah.
which work on a genetic level. And so now the body simply, and the longer we go, because it's a bit like an onion, right? The more
Yeah.
layers we bring in, all of a sudden the body is able to just function so much better. And we definitely see that on the epigenetic test. So in closing, what do we want to leave the listeners with? I mean, I stated my case. I find the true health test, sure, the epigenetic clock, I think it's really important, because even if we can see, for example, I'm 10 years biologically younger, but not on all my systems. And
Yeah.
so that was also, enlightening to see, oh, wait a moment. These are the areas where I need to have more care, take more impact, and definitely as a perimenopausal woman, hormonally, that's where, I'll look at, oh, wait a moment, that's where I'm the oldest. And,
Yeah.
it makes sense with everything that's happening. But it also made me want to take more action in terms of, well, how can I support my body in the right places? So epigenetic, yes, interesting, or epigenetic age clock, interesting and important. But the true health test for me is the true sort of
No pun intended.
yeah, and I think it's a test. I would go as far as saying, even if we only do the epigenetic test or the true health test twice a year.
Yeah.
And even if that's, I mean, dare I say, even if that's all you can do, right? And you can't go into that, is going to give you the most information. And by tracking and taking action, you are going to completely transform your health and your life. That is what I definitely believe.
And that was a motivation that we took, and why we spent, months, if not years, creating something like this, right? We could have, like, I'll be very honest, these epigenetic age tests, it's not just us, a lot of people in academia, other companies are creating. But one of the things that we always kept hearing was why? Why is my age this? And honestly, it's hard for us to explain why, right? Like, because aging is such a comprehensive, complex, biological process that you can't really pinpoint why you're older for just one thing. And so these EBPs and the epigenetic biomarker proxies that really make up the true health was our way to explain. Because if you think about it, all of the data is coming from the same data set. It's not like we're taking additional samples and running all of these different tests differently. We're taking the same exact data set and then reinterpreting it using different machine learning models. So your true health is directly comparable to your epigenetic age. So if you see that your age is higher, then you can go back to your true health and really understand which of those panels is really maybe contributing back to that age measure. Or, if you don't want to look at the age measure, then you just look at the true health measure. So it was our way of explaining from a comprehensive level what is really going on underneath. So I think more information, especially to the individuals, is better in this regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it hands the power to you in a very succinct way. If we can see, another thing that I'm definitely seeing a lot is, even though there's no overt immune issues, the immune system is weakened.
Yeah.
And so, we know if we, even though, and so these are people that will tell me, but I never get sick, I never have any issues, and, I'm so stunned that my immune system is so weak. Well, we know that a weakened immune system means a system that is not going to be able to respond to whatever is happening in the body that is not desirable. So we want to then absolutely work in restoring immune responsiveness. And I think a lot of times we talk about immune boosting, which I think is complete nonsense. We want an immune system that is able to respond. That's what we want. A sensitive enough, an unconfused enough immune system that is able to detect what needs to be done. Do I need to kill something off, or do I need to clean? Right? So, I mean, the reason why we talk so much about senescent cells is really because a confused immune system is not going to be able to get rid of senescent cells.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, and how do you track that, right? How do you have the necessary objective data to say that I have cleared it or I'm on the process of clearing? So, yeah, I mean, I think we know a lot of what we need to do. It's just we just don't know if it's happening under the hood, and I think that's where I think precision medicine, where I think a lot of these tests really rely on, really exists. And also, I don't want to knock individuals that are healthcare practitioners or providers. Like, these tests aren't going to replace having a doctor or having a physician or having a clinician around there, because those individuals are trained specifically to look at these values and really arrive at the point maybe quicker than the general public. And so, but in order for them to do their magic, that you need to give them the data so they can interpret. Or else it's just going to be hand wavy, like literal fortune telling. We don't want to do that, especially when somebody's life is on the line.
Absolutely. Well, and because we have the tools nowadays, that's where for me the fascination is. We really have everything these days. We don't need to be suffering. We don't need to stumble around in the dark. We've got all the tools, all the information, all the possibilities. My last kind of question and wondering is, you were talking about quercetin and dasatinib. Why not rapamycin?
Actually, so it's funny. I didn't speak about rapamycin specifically because we're recently just doing a full-fledged study on rapamycin. There was a company called Ageless RX that did do a recent study on rapamycin, and what they showed was that certain clinical variables were able to show improvements. So I believe there were certain physiological responses that were able to be improved. I'm blanking on which clinical factors, but the thing that I wanted to say was that the epigenetic clocks did not show significant change. The problem with that study, though, was that there are layers of these epigenetic age clocks. These original ones that were developed on chronological age, which at the time were great. But when you think about it, why would you use a clock that's built on chronological age if we've shown that your chronological age sometimes does not match your actual biological age? And so since then, we've actually been able to recreate some of these clocks based on mortality risk or even just rate of aging, and looking at a lot of these physical outputs and integrating that in there. And so that study didn't consider these new age clocks. And so we're actually working with another healthcare provider who's actually identified a set of individuals who are on rapamycin. And our initial results, so please take this with a grain of salt, but our initial results are suggesting that rapamycin does actually decrease those epigenetic age markers. And that healthcare practitioner is also combining that with clinical outputs. So what's really cool about this is that we can now see how congruent the epigenetic age clocks, the EBPs, and also the clinical values, how congruent are they, or how dissimilar they are. So then now we can kind of understand, what the clinical markers may be capturing or may not be captured versus the epigenetics. So it's on the way. It's on the way. We just have to get that paper ready and make sure that all of the nooks and crannies are filled.
Amazing. And so, in closing, what would we like to leave our listeners with? Besides, obviously, I think by listening to this podcast, I think anyone would be excited to get their epigenetics tested and to, really understand that the tracking is what's going to give them the long-term results and benefits. But with your experience and with what you've been seeing, what health tips would you want to give to people to say, like if you're only going to do a couple things, this is what you want to do, even as I'm saying, it's like,
Yeah.
we know the
There's so much
limitations.
more you could do. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not one to give advice, but maybe certain things that I've learned from just, even doing this
Yeah.
on myself is the importance of, and I hate saying this from a general sense, stress. Um, I think understanding mindfulness, things like this seem to have such a maybe not a negative connotation, but people are like, who cares about mindfulness? Like, who meditates? What's really the importance of meditation?
Yeah.
We start to see that individuals that are implementing this are really showing vast changes, but positive changes, not only from a physiological sense, but even from a molecular sense. So figuring out ways, whether it be, hanging out with a loved one, whether it be, being mindful of your work-life balance, exercising, whatever it is that allows your mind state to be less stressed, actually has implications in your molecular biology. So
Absolutely.
I think whatever that is, even if it means, getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep, which by the way, everyone should, there's a reason for that. And so I think just finding what brings that stress down through whatever means and tracking it, obviously, because you have to prove to yourself that you are actually doing that. I think that's honestly what we need to do in order to be able to improve our health span, not only our lifespan, but our health span as well.
Yes, it's actually a perfect way to end, because I do think, it's in some ways it's cliche. A lot of people talk about, stress and meditation, all of that, but we don't really quite understand the depth of impact that stress, and I would say most of my, 95% of my clients with severe health issues, they all have trauma that has not been resolved.
Yes.
Undeniably. And when we begin to address those traumas and empower the individual to reframe those traumas, whatever they might be, and they begin to experience their life differently, or their own pain differently for that matter, right? Because I also feel that in society nowadays, the new word is trauma informed. And there's so much work around that. But let's look less at the labels and let's work more heart to heart in just by me hearing you and allowing you to be heard. That already is magic for most people, because the reality is most people do not listen.
No, they don't. Hopefully they're listening to the podcast. I will say, hopefully they're listening to this.
Yes, but listening. So I really love that you said this stress point, and we tend to cliche it, but it is so crucial. So thank you for bringing that up, Varun, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. I think it's been so enlightening, and certainly it's made me even more enthusiastic about what you guys are doing and excited about the things that are coming out of your lab. I find you so progressive and refreshing. And super grateful for what you guys are doing.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for this platform. And I'm excited to see how individuals' lives are hopefully, positively influenced by these tests. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.